She gasped her final words, "I saw the black-eyed man," before her heart simply stopped. No signs of trauma. No weapon. Just pure terror. And she wasn't the first. It started on a Thursday. Ava Ramirez, a 28-year-old nurse with no prior medical conditions, was walking down the hallway of the emergency wing when she froze mid-step. The surveillance footage showed her turning slowly, her eyes locked on something just beyond the edge of the camera's view. Her body stiffened. A trembling hand rose to her mouth. She whispered something, silent, lip-readable only by experts, and then collapsed onto the floor. No one could revive her. No cause of death. No trauma. No cardiac failure. Nothing. The doctors were baffled. She was healthy. No substances in her system. The autopsy was inconclusive. But the whispers started before the coroner's report even came in. A cleaner claimed Ava had said something before she died, something that didn't make sense at the time. "He's watching me," the cleaner had recalled with unease. When asked who she meant, the woman simply shook her head and whispered. She looked terrified. 4 days later, a second case. Martin Doyle, 64, retired postmaster, was found dead in his living room, arm outstretched toward his landline phone. His face was frozen in a contorted expression of terror, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. His wife, who had been in the kitchen, swore he was fine just moments before. But she remembered hearing him talking to someone. No, not on the phone but in the room. He kept saying, "Who are you? What do you want?" And then the words came again, this time clear and undeniable. "I saw the black-eyed man." That's what she heard before the sound of his body hitting the floor. Coincidence, maybe. Stress, hallucinations, even early-onset dementia. Doctors considered all the possibilities. But it was the third case that began to show the pattern. Lena Wallace, a 22-year-old university student, was found dead in the campus library between 2 rows of dusty psychology journals. Her roommate claimed Lena hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. She kept saying someone was following her, always just out of sight. Always watching. A faceless figure with eyes like ink. "He doesn't blink," Lena had said during one particularly restless night. "He doesn't move. He just waits." She too had no signs of injury. No overdose. No underlying health problems. But again in the hours before her death, she called her brother and left a voicemail. It was only 3 words long, "Black-eyed man." The local police were forced to take notice. 3 unrelated deaths, each bizarre in its own right, now woven together by a phrase that had no meaning, at least none that made logical sense. There was no man. No suspect. No trace. No fingerprints. No footage. Just dead bodies and that same haunting phrase. The town's population was small, barely 10,000, and news traveled fast. Fear spread faster. People started avoiding public spaces. Children were kept indoors. Coffee shop conversations shifted from politics and gas prices to theories and warnings. "Don't look into mirrors at night," someone whispered in a bakery. "He comes through reflections," said another. "If you see him, it's already too late," murmured an elderly woman at a bus stop, her eyes glazed like she'd seen something once and never forgot. The 4th death happened at a gas station. The victim, Sean Brody, a long-haul truck driver, walked into the store to buy coffee. He paid, chatted briefly with the cashier and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he stopped. Slowly, his head turned toward the convex security mirror above the counter. He stared at it. And then he began shaking. Violently. The cashier, confused and frightened, called for help as Sean dropped to his knees and clawed at his own chest. "Get him out," he screamed. "He's in the mirror." The camera recorded every second, Sean writhing, panicking, gasping for breath, before he collapsed and died. The footage was reviewed dozens of times. The moment Sean looked at the mirror, something changed in his expression. Pure, unfiltered dread. But in the mirror itself? Nothing unusual. No shadow. No figure. No face. Just Sean alone, dying. 4 victims. All from different walks of life. All healthy. All struck down by something invisible. And all uttering the same phrase in their final moments. Detectives initially searched for environmental causes, gas leaks, undiagnosed toxins, psychological triggers, but nothing fit. The deeper they dug, the stranger the case became. The press began calling it the black-eyed curse. Experts in psychology suggested mass hysteria. Paranormal researchers proposed that a shared traumatic vision could manifest through fear. Rational minds dismissed it all, but one thing was undeniable. People were dying and no one could explain how or why. And then came the 5th case. A 6-year-old girl. She was playing alone in her backyard, moments after sundown. Her mother heard her laughing, then suddenly crying. By the time she reached her, the child was sitting on the grass, shaking. Her eyes locked on the tree line. "He's here," she whispered. "The man with the black eyes." She died in her sleep that night. No illness. No injury. No explanation. It no longer seemed like coincidence. It was something else, something that defied the natural order. A slow, creeping dread settled over the town like a fog. The words, "I saw the black-eyed man," became more than just a phrase. They became a countdown. And no one knew who was next. Mara Wexler was the only one who lived. 17 years old, quiet, introverted, the kind of girl who always lingered at the edges of the room. When she was brought into the ER, her breathing was shallow, her heart racing at an unstable rate. Her pupils were dilated. Her nails were bloodied from clawing at her own arms. She was screaming. Screaming not in pain, but in sheer primal fear. They had to sedate her to stop the convulsions. When she finally regained consciousness 3 days later, she refused to speak. Not a word. She wouldn't look at anyone directly. She wouldn't close her eyes either. Not even to blink. The nurses said she stayed awake for 32 hours straight. Just staring. Flinching whenever someone walked past her peripheral vision. Watching shadows like they might reach for her. Eventually, a psychologist was brought in. No parents. No siblings. Her only visitor was her aunt, who trembled each time she left the room. She wasn't like this before, the aunt kept saying. Something happened to her. Something evil. When Mara finally did speak, her voice was barely audible. A whisper, hoarse and broken. But the words chilled everyone who heard them. "I didn't invite him in. He came anyway." At first, no one knew what she meant. The psychologist tried to unpack it gently, walking her through dreams, anxiety, dissociation, even night terrors. But Mara kept returning to the same imagery. A man. Standing still. Watching. Never moving. Always present. Always patient. She first saw him in her dreams. That's how it began. Just a dream. One where she wandered her own home in the dark, looking for something. Or someone. She'd walk from room to room, but the lights wouldn't turn on. And then she'd see him, standing in the hallway, backlit by darkness. Motionless. Tall. Wearing an old-fashioned black suit. Not ragged. Not dirty. But precise. Crisp. Like he'd dressed carefully for something. His face was pale, almost gray and emotionless. Not angry. Not smiling. Just there. But his eyes were the worst part. Jet black. No whites. No irises. Just pits. Like holes carved into his face. She would always wake up gasping. For a few weeks it was just dreams. Then the sightings started bleeding into reality. It began in reflections. She'd see him behind her in the bathroom mirror. Or standing at the far end of a shop window as she passed by. But when she turned around, nothing. She started covering every mirror in her room with blankets. Her aunt thought she was going through a breakdown. Then she began seeing him in real life. Not just in glass. Once in the backyard at night. Another time on her way back from school. He wouldn't move. He didn't chase her. He didn't speak. Just stood there. Watching. That's when she stopped sleeping altogether. She said every time she closed her eyes, she felt him move closer. Like the dream was coming alive. She felt cold air brush her face in warm rooms. Heard faint breathing behind her when she was alone. Doors creaked open slowly even when locked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was subtle. Patient. Like he enjoyed watching her unravel. She tried everything, staying with friends, sleeping with lights on, burning sage like her aunt suggested. Nothing helped. Because it wasn't the place he haunted. It was her. Then one night she woke up and he was in her room. Standing by the closet door. Closer than ever. She couldn't scream. Couldn't move. Just stared. She said his presence felt like lead on her chest, like her lungs were being squeezed. He tilted his head once, just slightly as if curious. Then she passed out. That was the night her aunt found her on the floor, unresponsive, mumbling the words again and again. "Don't let him in. Don't let him in." When the story reached the local police, the connection was undeniable. Her words. Her description. The black-eyed man. It was the same figure every victim had spoken about, only this time she had lived. For now. But the psychologists weren't convinced. They called it a case of shared delusion. Possibly induced by media coverage. mass psychogenic illness. A theory that didn't explain how Mara described the figure before ever knowing about the others. She had been isolated from the news. Her aunt confirmed it. No internet. No TV. No phone. Mara hadn't heard about the black-eyed man. She saw him. And worse, she still did. Even in the hospital bed, Mara refused to be left alone. She begged to have someone watching her at all times. Not to protect her, but to confirm she wasn't imagining it. She said he visited every night now. Stood at the corner of her hospital room. The staff checked the security cameras. Nothing showed up. But every morning Mara would wake with fresh scratches on her arms. No one could explain how they got there. One nurse said she found her crying one night, sitting up in bed, her eyes fixed on the corner. The nurse asked what was wrong and Mara only whispered, "He's getting closer." Eventually, the hospital moved her to psychiatric care. The medical reports listed her condition as acute paranoid hallucination with dissociative tendencies. But the doctors didn't know what to make of the strange malfunction in her heart monitor every time she claimed he appeared. Sudden dips, spikes, irregular patterns that lasted exactly 7 minutes and then normalized. Every single time. Mara survived. But she wasn't safe. Not really. She kept saying the same thing over and over until the staff learned to ignore it. I didn't invite him in. He came anyway. The story could have ended there, with Mara's testimony and the wave of silent deaths haunting the town, but it didn't. Instead, it deepened in a direction no one expected. It was an old man, a retired journalist named Frank Delaney, who pulled at a thread everyone else had missed. He'd lived in the town for over 70 years and had seen strange things before. But this was different. He kept a collection of clippings and microfilm in his basement, articles dating back nearly a century. Yellowed papers, typewriter ink, faded photographs of people long dead. One evening, while reading about the recent wave of unexplained deaths, something clicked. A phrase. A name. The black-eyed man. He remembered hearing it once before, decades ago when he was just a boy. His father, also a journalist, had once investigated a series of unmentionable deaths that had shaken the town in 1939. Officially, those deaths were never solved. Unofficially, people whispered about a figure seen in the victim's final moments. A man with black, soulless eyes who appeared without reason and left no trace. Frank searched through old town archives stored at the public library, diving deep into forgotten records, coded incident reports, and sealed coroner documents. What he found horrified him. 23 deaths. All occurring over a 10-month span in 1939. Different ages, professions, backgrounds. But each recorded as unexplained or no known cause. Hidden in the coroner's private notes, never meant for public view, was a recurring detail scribbled in pencil. Final words, "I saw the black-eyed man." Frank pushed further, accessing the personal journals of Dr. Elijah Cartwright, the town's lead physician at the time. They were locked in a wooden trunk, left in storage at the local museum and long ignored. With permission from the curator, Frank unearthed the leather-bound volumes. What he read chilled him to the core. Cartwright had not dismissed the cases as natural. On the contrary, he believed the victims had been selected. Not by chance but by judgment. According to his writings, each of the 23 individuals had carried a secret, something they had done, hidden, or denied. Cheating spouses, thieves, abusers. A local priest who preyed on his congregation. A respected teacher who had driven a student to suicide. Sins buried under reputation and denial. Cartwright believed this entity, this black-eyed man, only came when the rot beneath the surface reached a certain depth. He wrote, "It is not death he brings but reckoning. He does not kill. He watches. And what they see reflected in his gaze is what ends them." Cartwright's descent into obsession was well documented in the final pages of his journal. He claimed the black-eyed man had begun appearing to him too, first in dreams, then in mirrors, finally outside his home. He boarded his windows shut. He stopped eating. He began confessing to people at random, begging forgiveness for things no one understood. 2 weeks later he died of exhaustion and acute cardiac failure, though he was only 48 years old. The town declared him mentally unstable. His journals were never made public. The events of 1939 were written off as stress-induced illness brought on by economic depression and wartime anxiety. But Frank saw the same signs repeating now, only worse, faster, more brazen. As if whatever this thing was, it was growing bold again. Frank wrote an anonymous letter to the local newspaper. He didn't sign his name. He only included the facts, dates, phrases, similarities. The editor never published it. Said it would incite panic. Said they couldn't risk feeding delusions. But word still got out. It always does. And with it came something else. Confessions. People started coming forward, quietly, privately, admitting things they'd never told anyone. A man confessed to abandoning his sister during a fire when they were teenagers. A woman admitted she had intentionally hit a child with her car 20 years ago and never stopped. A teacher told a priest he'd covered up a bullying case that led to suicide. They weren't just unburdening their guilt. They were afraid. They believed. Because every one of them had the same fear. They'd seen something. A shadow in the hallway. A man on a distant sidewalk who wasn't there when they blinked. A reflection out of sync. They all described the same thing, the black-eyed man. Always watching. Never moving. Silent. Waiting. No one had told Mara about these old cases. She hadn't read the journals or the news clippings. Yet her descriptions matched Cartwright's word for word. Her behavior mirrored the 1939 survivors, at least the ones who made it long enough to talk. That's when Frank realized the truth. This thing wasn't random. It was recurring. Cyclical. Something that returned once a generation to collect what was owed. But this time was different. The frequency was increasing. The deaths were coming faster. There was no longer a 10-month span. It was happening weekly. Almost daily. And Mara? She was still alive. Which meant the cycle wasn't complete. Or maybe it was just beginning. Frank tried to warn people. He called into radio shows, tried publishing the story online, even sent the journals to independent investigators. But most laughed. Some ignored him. A few blocked him outright. The town's officials insisted there was no evidence, no threat, no supernatural presence. But those who had seen the black-eyed man didn't need convincing. They knew what was coming. The silence